We're really excited to have you here, and we're especially pumped to welcome our guests to our first Organizing Stories workshop this spring. My name is Monica Huerta. I'm a professor in English and American Studies at Princeton, and here's our basic plan. So to start us off, I'm just going to give us a really brief overview of Organizing Stories as a project. I'll introduce our team. And then after that, Professor Womack will introduce our amazing and talented and brilliant and gifted speakers for today. And then after the workshop, or the conversation between Professor Steele and Jamilah Lemieux, we will launch into and field whatever questions you have for our speakers. So, especially for those of you all who haven't been to one of our workshops before, request. Organizing Stories Toward a Scholarly Activist Praxis is a multimodal project that Professor Autumn Womack and I have been dreaming up since 2 summers ago, I guess now, with Promise, our undergrad researchers, and the support from the Exploratory Grant and the Collaborative Humanities, the Dean of Faculty's Office, the Department of African American Studies, the Center for Human Values, the New Center of American Studies, and the department, I said that right, the African Studies Colloquium. Our team is dedicated to building new avenues of exchange between Princeton and community-based social justice work. We want to amplify as we experiment with a scholarly activist praxis that builds on a tradition of continuing intellectual work and movement work, of interconnecting them. And we want to do that primarily towards exploring the ways that movements need, use, and expand practices of storytelling and this semester archiving, as they did the same for movements of social and racial justice. This year, in the ongoingness of COVID-19, we're still hosting virtual workshops for students and faculty, and hopefully, fingers crossed, finally expanding our offerings to in-person workshops and events in the fall. Along the way at Organizing Stories, we're guided by 4 basic principles, and they're these. The first is we honor activists' intellectual labor. The second is we prioritize relationship building between students and activists. The third is we want the thinking that happens in our space to be truly collaborative. And fourth, we strive to build relationships between the organizers and activists, humanities scholars, and students who come to our events each time. So those are the values and goals of Organizing Stories. And this semester, our theme that we chose was Feminism's Archives. And with that, I will hand things off to Professor Womack.
Thank you, Monica. And again, thank you all for being here. It really is exciting to see you guys and see so many familiar faces from last year's Organizing Stories workshop. I'm going to introduce our 2 really amazingly esteemed guests today. I'll just say that when we came up with the idea for this year's theme, which is Feminism's Archives, Catherine's work immediately popped into our, Dr. Steele's work, immediately popped into our mind as somebody we wanted to invite. So we were happy to be able to think alongside her and bring Jamilah Lemieux into the conversation. So without further ado, Catherine Knight Steele is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Maryland, College Park, and was the founding director of the African American Digital Humanities Initiative. She now directs the Black Communication and Technology Lab as part of the Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism Network funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Catherine's research on the Black blogosphere, digital discourse of resistance and joy, and digital Black feminism has been published in such journals as Social Media and Society, Information, Community and Society, and Feminist Media Studies. She is the author of the beautiful and brilliant Digital Black Feminism, which came out from NYU Press in 2021, which examines the relationship between Black women and technology as a centuries-long gendered and racial project in the US. Jamilah Lemieux is a renowned cultural critic and writer with a focus on issues of race, gender, and sexuality. She is a leading millennial feminist thinker, influencer, and game-changing media maverick. Her written work has been featured via a host of print and digital platforms, including Vanity Fair, the Los Angeles Times, The Nation, Essence, Refinery 29, Playboy, Self, Wired, The Guardian, Color Lines, The Washington Post, and the Columbia Journalism Review. She is also a weekly contributor to Slate's Care and Feeding Parenting column and co-host of the publication's Mom and Dad Are Fighting podcast. An important voice in the construction of the Black feminist blogosphere of the early 21st century, Lemieux formerly served as the vice president of news and men's programming for I1 Digital and as a senior editor for Ebony magazine. She penned the foreword for the Verso anniversary edition of Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, and the 2017 re-release of Ann Petrie's Miss Muriel and Other Stories. Please join me in giving a very warm and generous welcome to Dr. Steele and Jamilah Lemieux.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please call me Catherine.
I never know what people are going to say, and I'm like, you can call me Autumn. It's not.
Well, thank you, Autumn and Monica, for the wonderful introduction and for having this space. And thank you, Catherine, for choosing me to be in conversation with you, and for taking my work seriously enough to include it in your work, specifically in digital Black feminism, which is such an important record keeping of something that's been truly significant in my life, obviously in a deeply personal way, but I think of a culture shift that largely went ignored by not just mainstream media, but even culture media, you know, that our spaces did not really take seriously the impact that Black women are having, have been having online. And so, nor did they take seriously the threats that came with them, which led to a lot of things being workshopped on us, you know, used successfully in disinformation campaigns to follow, et cetera. I wanted to start with talking about your goals for putting together digital Black feminism, and I'll read from the intro. You said they're twofold. The first is that we begin to rightly position Black women online as central to the future of communication technology. And you brilliantly trace the history of Black women's engagement with technology from chattel slavery to the internet. And show how technology has been a double-edged sword for us at many times, and a tool that we've been able to leverage for opportunity, you know, being able to type, you know, and something that's been used to leave us out and do harm to us. And so you reposition Black women online as purveyors of digital skill and expertise, not deficient in, or in need of new skills to survive a changing digital landscape, which is contrary to how Black people in general, and oftentimes Black women specifically, are talked about in relation to technology, right? That we're being left behind. Black women without extensive programming experience have maximized platform affordances, built transmedia platforms, led platform migrations, pushed platform policy changes regarding hate speech and content moderation, and introduced us to new pay structures as a precursor to influencer culture. So for those folks who haven't read the book yet, I have a twofold, and that's part one of your goals for the book. Before we get into the second part, I want you to talk about how and why Black women have been able to be so effective online, considering all the barriers put between us and success in most arenas. Why do we flourish in this space in the way that we have?
Thank you for that. And I just have to start by saying I am giddy to be in conversation with you. You know, for those who have read the book, you know what a prominent role Jamilah's work plays in this research. And I have spent, you know, decades reading your work, it feels like, and writing about, and it was really a privilege to write about the important work that you've done in this space, the game-changing work that you've done in this space. I'm so grateful for it in so many ways, both professionally and personally, what you've done in your writing. So your question about why have Black women been able to do this? And this was really the impetus for starting to look backward, because as you put it, as I look at the literature as it existed, both academic research and like the journalism about Black women online, so much of what was written from this deficiency model, was written from this place of like, we're either not present, which is what I was introduced to in grad school, was like digital divide research. We're not here, you know, and I'm like, that's not what's going on. I'm going home, or I'm sneaking between class to read every day what Black women are doing online. And so I started out like wanting to trace what was happening right now, but realized that that really fell short of explaining the context of how and why Black women are able to, when given the barest scraps of access, do the most. And that's not a new idea, you know? And so it would really be short-sighted to talk about that simply from the perspective of what's going on in social media right now, which is what I saw a lot of folks trying to do, is explain Black women on TikTok, or explain Black women on Twitter, or explain Black women on Instagram. And I'm not a historian, but there was no way to tell this story without doing that long history, which actually set up the way that this has been happening all along, right? To like look back and see that at every point during the construction of this country, that what was happening was Black women were being told and being excluded from the narrative of technological prowess, of expertise. But at every single point, it was Black women who were leading in innovation. We're leading in innovation about the way that we speak, right? We're leading in innovation about the way that we took care of home, the way that we work, the way that movements were formed, right? And so I look to social movement scholars who write about Black women's role in every social movement of import in the last, 2 centuries in this country. And the way that those things get written out of our history really does us a disservice and puts us in a place where in 2020 and 2022, we're still asking this question like, oh, well, how are Black women able to do that? We should know this if we had the history right. If we had been writing this all along and been documenting this and been pushing back against these narratives, we would have a much better sense of how we come to this place. And I think to your point, we would be looking to Black women to answer the questions about the future, right? And we wouldn't have missed the mark so gravely about things like the violence and hate that people experience online, the disinformation campaigns, because Black women have been flagging this and have been finding their way through this for years before it came to the attention of the mainstream press. So that really was the first point, was that if we want to understand what's going on here, you actually have to look at the folks who have navigated their way through a technology that wasn't built for them. Those are the folks that understand the technology best, because they've had to learn it in ways that were not outlined, were not provided. They've learned all the intricacies of it and have understood both the possibilities but also the constraints. They know the limitations of these mediums in ways, in really personal ways, that perhaps the folks who even design them don't understand.
So you say that the second goal of digital Black feminism is to document a shift in Black feminist principles and praxis and ensure we consider digital Black feminist thinkers' online work as central to the ongoing work of liberation. Why? Why are you placing the work of people like myself and Feminista Jones in conversation with Ida B. Wells and Zora Neale Hurston and Anna Julia Cooper? Why do you think that's necessary?
I think it's so necessary and so important. And it was a frustration for me that I felt like folks were learning what Black feminist praxis was by reading your work, by reading Feminista's work, by reading other folks' work. And instead, what we were doing was suggesting, some folks were suggesting that this wasn't real Black feminist scholarship, that this was outside of theory, that this was outside of, of our serious conversations about Black feminist work. And the arguments that they were making about why it was is because this was happening in a space that they weren't taking seriously, right? So if folks were creating Twitter threads or were, posting jokes alongside their work, were actually showcasing their whole lived experience right next to their public scholarship, that in some way diminished for people the fact that they were doing serious work. And that makes no sense. It's outside of what we understand Black feminist work to look like. And so it was a confusing moment for me, but one that felt like it needed to be documented. Also, what's concerning to me is that I can go back, and I did for this book, go back into the archives of Anna Julia Cooper and Ida B. Wells. And I was able to read things that they wrote on the back of postcards. And I was able to look at the letters that they sent to their universities. I was able to scour through these pages and pages and pages that had been preserved and digitized at various institutions. And there's a concern that I had about the ability for us to do that with what was happening right now, right? Like there is clearly right now engagement in social and political movements and work of Black feminist thought that is so important. And yet, where is the documentation of that? Is it going to exist in 10 years? Are we going to be able to talk about that? Are we going to be able to see that in the same way that we do for other things? And so that's why I really wanted to, stop and think through how to preserve that. Sorry, my child is knocking furiously at the door right now. He forgot the memo about that 1 hour block, but he's good. So I really wanted to preserve that. I really wanted to set aside a space that said, we have to think about this right now because we don't know how long these moments are still going to be with us online. We think about these moments as being here forever in digital space, but they're in fact fleeting. In a year or two, some of these blogs have disappeared. Some of these apps are gone. And what's more than that, we don't control those archives. We don't control how long they're accessible online and who they're accessible to. And so if we don't write this history now, we're going to lose it.
Okay. Later in the book, you write, 20, well, actually, before we get into that, I'm curious to know what's your origin story with the internet? Like, when did you become a Black girl online? I think for those of us that are visible or have been visible, in social media and in the blogosphere, the moment that was the Black girl blogosphere, and for those that have been participants alike, many of us started engaging with social media really early, and I think for our generation in particular, it wasn't designed for kids. Right. It starts with Black Planet and MySpace and places that weren't necessarily appropriate for people your age, but where those conversations about feminism were brewing from the very beginning. So I'm curious to know, where did it start for you?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where we start counting. I had a Black Planet account way too young, probably as well. And, was in the chat rooms as soon as it was possible to be in the chat rooms, which is probably like, early high school, I'm thinking, when we could like sneak away to a computer lab and have a teacher that didn't quite know how to block certain features on those devices. But I think like in earnest, my introduction to like Black feminism online was through the blogosphere. And so it's the reason that I'm so wholeheartedly dedicated to still tracking and writing about that space, is because of the import it had on my own life. I remember, leaving undergrad and coming back to Chicago and working my first job and being like, this is awful. I don't know who these people are, but they are not living lives like mine. I'm sitting in this cubicle and I didn't understand the people that I worked with day to day. I didn't relate to them. I wasn't understanding how they were functioning in this space and being so happy, and I was so miserable. And so what I had was the blogosphere. That was the place that I could go and be myself and see other folks who were having conversations I actually cared about and that are actually relevant to my life and were speaking in ways that really resonated with me. And I won't say that like I discovered Black feminine. I think Joan Morgan's book in undergrad was game changing for me. That hip hop feminism changed my life, as a 18, 19-year-old person. But the blogosphere was really a place of, I call it in the book, an enclave, right? It was this safe place that was away from the reality of what we were dealing with in other spaces. And it existed in a way, it's, I think, hard sometimes for folks who come to the social media era right now to process what this looked like, because Twitter landscape is so different, right? The internet functions in such a different way right now. But folks were not checking for our blogs, right? They were not like scouring to like push hate into these spaces. They didn't know they existed. It was hard to even find them unless you knew about them, right? You had to kind of be in the know to know who was blogging where. And once you got engaged in that network, obviously you could have access to those things. But it was a really different time. So there was this really communal space. And it's not like there were disagreements, and it's not like people were all on the same page, but the kind of dialogue that was possible in a space that was hidden from the dominant group was a moment. And it really was, I think, game changing for so many of us who went on to either be public scholars or commentators or political activists or went into research or lots of other places and are still writing today in really brilliant ways. But it really changed the atmosphere. It changed the possibilities of what we could do on social media later. Let me ask you a question, because I think that really leads to, I write in the book about how your work online, it moves between these spaces that are sometimes very like mainstream blogs or news sites, and sometimes are self-owned places. And what is your relationship? How do you think your relationship with that early blogosphere impacts where you decide to write and how you decide to engage in Black feminist writing online?
I had a really interesting journey, from the blogosphere onward. And I really was just figuring it out as I went along, I'd say the fact that my writing, so I didn't go to school for journalism. I went to school for theater. I started my blog at the end of my time in college. People had told me my whole, I was crazy for not majoring in something writing related. You're a writer, you should have been in some sort of writing program. It was pretty surprising to people that I hadn't, but I kind of ran from writing. And then at the end of my college career, when I wasn't sure what I actually wanted to do, I ran toward writing and I started a blog, and it just kind of took on a life of its own. And it made me realize that okay, I can actually do this. I want to do this. I'm going to figure this out. And I think that because I started with my own platform and had the very fortunate luck of working almost exclusively for Black platforms and reporting to Black women editors, from that point on, at the beginning of my career, I've yet to want to put myself in a position where I've had to write things that I didn't want to write or that I wasn't passionate about, if that makes sense. So I've been fortunate enough to be somewhat choosy. There've been, for me in my career, it's feast or famine, so I can't say that I'm not Lovey or Kimberly, who's figured it out and has had a substantial platform and, been paying their bills from blogging for years. That's not me.
Yeah.
I sell a big story and do that for a minute and, figure it out along the way. But I've also, I think, because of having autonomy over the stories I was able to tell, and my first real job, big job in the industry was at Ebony.com, where I helped to create the website. So I was part of this team that took an old school brand and had this feminist reimagining of it. And so I was able to assign myself stories and assign stories to writers that had, the sort of voice that I wanted to read. And so after being able to do that, at 26, I couldn't see myself saying, well, now I want to go work at Gawker,
Right.
and have to tell someone else's stories, or even at Jezebel. And these were platforms that I read and found interesting, but the idea of having to give up so much of the control that I've been able to have over my voice throughout my career, I think starting as a blogger made that unappealing. And I think that's why, so many of the folks who started their careers in that moment created platforms that, whether they identified primarily as writers first, like Demetria Lucas, or as content creators, which I would think that Lovey would identify herself as, that success really depends upon being able to find a way to do you, as opposed to fitting into a corporate mold.
No, I love that, because I think that's really the brilliance of what the blogosphere provided. And that's the uniqueness of being able to start in a space where you are in charge of not only your words, but how your words look on the screen and what will surround them. Will there be advertising? Will you link to other folks? And that kind of control that you talk about, I think is so impactful in just changing the mindset of what my words can do and where I will place them and the value and import that I put on those words. So I think you captured just brilliantly that kind of transition that you speak about so many folks who started in that blogging space making. So that's I don't know, I'm really excited to hear that that was true because I thought so. But I'm wondering then about that, because this Organizing Stories kind of program talks a lot about activism and social justice work. And I don't tend to position the research I do as activism because I think that activists make a lot more sacrifice for their work than I'm called upon to make for my writing. But I do hope that I'm able to capture some of what's going on in social justice movements and activism, but through the lens of telling the story of the fullness of Black life. Because sometimes I think we assign that if Black folks are doing writing online, then they're doing activist work or they're doing social justice work. And so many of the bloggers and writers that I write about were writing about like writing lifestyle blogs or, you know, natural hair blogs or mommy blogs, right? And they were talking about things that were not directly named as political commentary. So I wonder, like, as you think about your work, but also just this idea more broadly about social justice writing and research and activism online, where do you position yourself and the work that you do, and how do you see it in relationship to this idea of social justice work or activism?
I think that my work and the work of, you know, the folks who I would consider my peers lives, you know, adjacent to activism in an important way. You know, I often cite Tony Kaye at Bambara and the job of the writer is to make revolution irresistible, you know, so the sort of activism that we need to move society forward doesn't exist or doesn't work without people having proper perspective on issues of race and gender and identity and such, right? And that there are things that we need them to know. If you're going to fight for my liberation, you need to know that I'm a whole human being. You need to know that despite me not being a cishet male, you know, a cishet white male, that I have a right to exist in the society, and that there's specific things that I encounter and that I'm navigating. So as you say, you're fighting for my freedom as a part of whatever group that you know, and I belong to together. You have to see the whole me. And as a writer, and, you know, somebody who's shared thoughts in public, I think that is something that I'm equipped to do. You know, I don't think of myself as an activist. You know, even at the time in which I was more, I'm not terribly active on social media anymore, but during the time where I was, and then the height of that kind of, you know, moment between, or those years between the death of Trayvon Martin and, or really the Gina 6, you know, incident on through the beginning of the Trump administration, for those of us that kind of use social media to raise certain ideas in an urgent way. Like, I think of that as activism adjacent, you know, but I wouldn't call it activism. Other people would, and I think that's okay, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. And I agree with your idea that that's okay, and it's also really important, even if it's not activism. And like I think that that telling the fullness of who we are and our experiences is the only mechanism by which people begin to acknowledge our humanity in full and our ability to be fully human in public, knowing that folks are watching, but doing so like not because they're watching. I always like look to Zora Neale Hurston, who writes about like concepts of privacy and like Black folks doing things in public, but not like so that white folks watch, like with the knowledge that white folks will be there, but like without the desire to prove anything or to, you know, demonstrate anything or to perform anything, is what is at the core of really talking about the fullness of Black life. And so I really have appreciated that through the blogosphere, and made a really conscious choice early on to not study overtly political blogs for that reason, right? Like I was less interested in folks who are like, I am here to you know, advocate for this policy, and instead like I'm here to just be. And in those places, I think is where we tend to find some of the most interesting and important work that's happened historically in Black spaces. And so I wonder, because I think you made a point just now about kind of like not being on social media as much. I think that's true for most of the folks, in fact, that I write about in the book, that they've moved away from a lot of the platforms where they were most popular at some point and are doing different kinds of writing and different kinds of online work now. So what do you think about how we as researchers should try to not even locate, but catalog or archive or document the work that's happening when it's no longer happening in the places that we used to look to find it? If it's not happening in the blogosphere or it's not happening on social media, what's our role as a research community in documenting the kind of work that you do?
You know, I think it's really worth checking in, you know, if you're interested in what Black feminist communication online looks like today, for example, that you check in with some of those voices that were definitive members of the, you know, Black feminist blogosphere, and find out why they're not in those spaces anymore. I think overwhelmingly there's a story of abuse and harassment and negative engagement overtaking positive engagement. You know, the amount of anxiety I have about doing things that, like, I don't promote the stuff that I do. You know what I mean? Because
I understand that feeling well.
You know, because I don't want to be Zoom bombed or, you know, otherwise trolled. It's become, I think that for those of us who entered this space when it was far more permissible to be hostile to Black women online, that we've kind of come to the end of the road in terms of being able to openly engage, because the negative engagement drives away the positive engagement. You know, people don't want to be targeted by the people that are targeting you.
That's right.
You know, and for, you know, myself and others, there have been out and out character assassinations online, you know, things that have been said about, for me personally, myself and a member of my family, you know, and this information that continues to travel and snowball, and, you know, these really despicable rumors about someone who's not a celebrity or a big noteworthy figure who you would think would be subject to this sort of, you know, gossip and harassment. I think that among that group of people, you'll still find really interesting work being done, you know, with Feminist and her Patreon, and Lovey, and, you know, the platforms that she's created herself. I just sold a book, and I'm, you know, I've had some pretty decent bylines in the past few years. You know, I waited until after your deadline to send notes. I was just so anxious about reading it. It was hard for me, a lot of ways, to go back to that moment in time, you know, because there's a lot of trauma and, you know, kind of anxiety related to it, but also just, and maybe this is connected to that, but just having a hard time, like, really giving myself credit for what I've been a part of, you know, which I think women, you know, are often want to do. You know, it's hard for us to give ourselves any real credit, but I've amassed some pretty cool bylines in the past couple of years, you know, and I think also that the work is being done in quieter ways, you know, that I don't think you're getting people that are building up followings the way that we once did. I think you're getting smaller, you know, decentralized conversations, you know, that are still impactful, and, you know, work that's being published and important things that are being shared on social media by, you know, young, hungry voices. But I think they're less focused on, I think, one, the seizing upon of Black women in public is so much so that, like, you can't really make another Jamilah or Feminista right now, because nobody, you know, it's just,
who would step up to, who would take that on, knowing what's going to come to them, you know?
knowing what's going to come of that. And then also just the way that I think people are kind of cut off at the knees at the first sign of their imperfection. You know, I think that we were fortunate to have, you know, come up as bloggers during a time where you could be complicated.
That's right.
About that, you know, I think we talked about our personal lives. So it was not just like that combination of like, oh, they're outside the academy and they're using humor, but it was like, yes, and we're also talking about our personal lives, you know, I became a single mother in public,
Mhm.
and as we know, Black single mothers, one of the most loathed groups of people in the country. And so in front of an audience of people, many of whom were already invested in seeing me fail,
That's
I'm
right.
now proof of the community's failure, yeah, I think that it's just, people aren't really given the opportunity to, I think there are other places, like there's these YouTubers and folks, like I sound like an old person, these YouTubers.
These YouTubers today, these TikTokers.
But other places where you can go and experience, Gen Z young Black women and millennial Black women and Gen X Black women, being open and honest about their complicated lives and, doing the work of feminism at the same time. But I don't think you'll ever, I don't know that we'll see a moment like we did.
Yeah. I think we've moved in a different direction as like I think digital culture has moved in a different direction, and like kind of the requirements necessary to be online and as you put it, like the harshness, the lack of nuance that's possible with some of the affordances of the platforms we have now. And I think that's why, I always come back to the blogosphere as being a really unique place where folks got to be nuanced, complicated individuals within a community of folks who are also nuanced, complicated individuals. And we're like hoping to receive the same grace that was provided, But I don't know, I guess I hear you also saying that like there's a cycling back to that kind of space, right? That it's just maybe not visible, but that people are still forming these communities, these small, ways of being in community with other folks. They're just not in the places that the journalists and the researchers are looking, because we're looking at places like, oh, let's look at TikTok, or let's look at whatever the latest app is. And the apps are really not providing maybe that same kind of communal space that we saw previously. So I'm heartened that folks are moving off of social media and doing other kinds of work and reclaiming what was good about those spaces and what was necessary about those spaces into the present. I think that's what we always do. A question that I get asked frequently when doing the book talk is like, what's next? What do you see as the next place where, what are Black women going to do next if they're being harassed online? Where I was like, the thing I'm never worried about is if Black women are going to figure things out. Like I'm never concerned that some app is the end of Black feminist thought, or some medium is the end of revolutionary thought, because what Black women have shown, I think historically through all of this, is that the ability to take what is there and turn it into something useful, practical, helpful, that helps folks survive, that helps us thrive, that helps us grow and move forward, even when it seems like the tool is meant to cause harm. So I'm never concerned about that. We might not be privy to it, and that might be the point, I think, in some ways of this whole process. I thought do you have any more questions you wanted to talk through, or do you think we should open it up for some questions from folks who are here?
I have more, but we can open it up. I want to make sure we have time.
Well, feel free to throw them in too. We'll see if anybody has any to start out with.
Okay.
Thank you guys. Yeah, and we can weave back in whatever comments or questions you guys have for each other throughout. So no, I could just listen to you guys talk all day. Folks, if you have questions, feel free to either just raise your hand. We're a small enough group, or you can pop them in the chat if you would like us to narrate them. While people are getting their thoughts together, I had a really quick question that maybe both of you can speak to. And Catherine, one of the things I was really excited about that you said in response to one of Jamilah's questions, or kind of in the earlier part of the conversation, was you mentioned that, Black feminist technology makers and negotiators and practitioners, right, had always been kind of aware of the constraints and the technology, even more so sometimes than the makers of the technology themselves, which I just think is a really brilliant way of thinking about the way that Black women have positioned themselves in relation to technology. And I just wanted to hear you both talk a little bit about kind of what that negotiation of, or knowledge of some of the technical or technological or conceptual constraints of the technology, what that looked like, and some of the, Catherine, the people that you've studied, or Jamilah in your own work, and kind of how you maybe know more about the possibilities with technology than even the makers themselves.
I think that there are so many examples from from social media sites like Twitter or Instagram of how sites were not designed to do certain things. And then Black folks came upon the scene and they started doing these the primary example that folks always use is like hashtagging, right, from Twitter, and the way that hashtags were never intended to do what they have come to do, right? Like the way that we began to use hashtags to tell jokes, to create communal spaces, to, like signifying. I see Sarah Florini on this call who's written about this extensively, like the signifying practices that happen in Black Twitter's hashtagging. But I write about like Instagram and influencer culture. And I think that what's really interesting is that, when Instagram comes to be, it's really thought of as like kind of a photography app at the start, right? Like people think that this is a place to like capture beautiful moments in their lives, right? And like become these amateur photographers. And folks immediately were like, this is a branding site. Like this is a place for me to create a brand in order to promote something. And so much of that I think is linked to, for Black women, like the necessity to have to use places like that for things like promotion all along. Because if you are a small business owner as a Black woman and don't have access to all of the capital and the loans and the resources that we throw at other kinds of folks who are starting small businesses or who are lifestyle entrepreneurs or who are working out, right? Then you have to be creative and you have to figure out how to use platforms like an Instagram that have an image-based premise and have image-based affordances and not text, to actually showcase yourself as the brand, as the product, right? So if I am selling hairstyles, or if I am selling words, or if I am selling food, like I am the brand also, and it's not just the food. And that is the precursor to that influencer culture that is now ubiquitous online, and it seems like the only use of Instagram now, right? Is that that's what we use Instagram for, is for self-promotion in some way. But I think that really like stems out of this recognition of the possibilities of that app and the constraints. Like that app is not going to do X, Y, and Z for me, but it can do this. And so I can use it in that way. And we see the same thing popping up, I think, on TikTok right now. I'm loving watching Black folks navigate the algorithm on TikTok and restricting access to their work, not by putting some lockbox on it, because that's not possible, but through the kinds of hashtag that they use, through the kinds of sounds that are chosen that don't rise to the top of certain For You pages, but rise to the top of others. And I think that really comes from a recognition of how folks were stealing content from Black content creators in that space, and how to start mitigating that in some way, like how to start turning off certain audiences to your work and turning on other audiences to your work.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah.
I think it's very much in alignment with how Black women survive most spaces, which is that we have to figure out another way around, like we have to figure out not a cheat code necessarily, but we have to figure out how to make this work for us with what we've got, and so for us, because social media offered us so many things, like as Catherine said, the ability to brand oneself in your business, the ability to find community with people that are having the same challenges that you're having. You're the only person in the office who looks like you. You're off at school and you don't have many people to talk to about some of the things that you're feeling. This place offers that to you. So you become incredibly adept at navigating it, and you use it in ways beyond what the people who created it envisioned it to be able to do, because, we're creative people the same way that we stretch food out, in ways beyond what the folks manufacturing it expected, you to do with a jar of spaghetti and a box of noodles. You figure out entire feast from that. And so that's what we've done. We've been given spaghetti and noodles, and we've, spaghetti sauce and noodles, and we've made a feast of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really wonderful way to think of it. Do other folks in the Zoom room have questions? Yeah, Kimberly.
Yeah, so I have two questions, if that's okay. My first question is, interestingly enough, I guess run a blog too, but it's on like Instagram. So I was wondering, like, at like the start of your blog, how did you maintain, like, for example, like work or school, and also maintain the blog? How did you like remain consistent? Because I like completely stopped using my blog because of school, and it kind of impacted like my interactions and engagement and stuff like that. So I just wanted to know, like, how did you like have that balance? And my second question was like something you guys already started talking about, but like, how does like your identity of being a Black woman like become an obstacle, but and also at the same time like a, I guess like a pull or like a something that elevates you at the same time? So just like, what are some ways that your identity like reflects in your career, your like life in general?
Thank you for your questions, Kimberly. I am you. So my blog always suffered because of, rather something was going to suffer, either my work or the blog. And so what suffered in my life for the majority of the time that I was had an actual blog that I maintained, it was work. So I got fired from 2 full-time jobs that I was completely disinterested in, but I maintained them because I needed a job. And it's because I spent my days blogging and trying to get my engagements up and debating with people on Twitter. And the second time that happened to me, I realized that I had to make a choice. I was going to be a writer or wasn't, but I couldn't keep wasting people's money, you know, getting paid for work while I just wanted to be on the internet all day. And so I made it my work to be on the internet all day, you know, but when I got a full-time job, I ended up letting my blog go. I had a place to publish work. So you could say mission accomplished. I no longer had to have my own platform, but I missed it, you know, and I've been struggling to find the time to platform myself that way again. I do have a newsletter, you know, which I think is a kind of gentle way of blogging, so that way when you feel up to publishing something, you send it out and your subscribers can get it, but you're not on the hook for people to be coming to a website looking for regular content. So if you can send out 2 newsletters in a month, that's great, you know, and your subscribers will get it. And when you're in a space where you feel like publishing more content, you can focus on publishing more content, you can write it into your schedule, because that's also one way, you know, of approaching it. Of course, saying you're carving out time to write and you're committing to that. But if you're unable to do so, you know, consider maybe starting a newsletter. The second part of your question, I think everything I've done professionally has been to the best of my ability. I've tried to center Black womanhood. So that's kind of where it shows up in my work, that I've just always wanted to be in service to us. And so ultimately I feel that like my work helps Black women to feel better. Perhaps it's because I'm able to clarify some things to people on their behalf about us. Maybe it's because I'm able to say, I can name some things that they're experiencing that they aren't able to write in a 1,500 word essay, a name, you know, but me giving voice to it helps them to process their experience. But yeah, that's where Black womanhood shows up for me. So it's inherently of value because it's, you know, it's inherently of value to me in terms of my work because it's central to my work.
I mean, I'll reiterate, I'll say the same thing there, is that I can't imagine doing what I do without Black folks at the center, because it's what makes me want to do my job. Like I don't want to do research on others. I want to do research on us. And I want to do it in a way that extends the kind of care to folks that I don't see frequently happening in research. And that's really where I land on studying Black folks as a Black person, is that like, I see a lot of extraction in the academy and the way that people write about social movements, write about Black culture. And I think that it is very much a requirement for me to think about my approach to collecting, writing about, analyzing work that folks have generously provided to the world as like, kind of like a dog, like first do no harm. Like first, let me make sure that the work that I'm doing doesn't cause, what Jamilah talked about, the continued harm on folks that they are experiencing in these places, that I treat their work like it is a gift to us and that we should be grateful to have the opportunity to care for it and to hold it for some period of time and to provide it back to other folks with our analysis, right? And with an analysis that doesn't do the work of causing additional kinds of harms. And so that's my perspective on it, is that like I center unapologetically Black discourse, Black discursive practice, Black feminism in every, research project that I'm engaged in. And very early in my career, I was asked that question by a faculty member, was like, you're going to get named as like the person who studies Black folks. And I was like, okay, and let it be that. And let it be that, because in studying Black folks, and I say it two ways. One, Black folks are worthy of study all by ourselves without a comparative analysis of how we're like or dislike other groups or communities, right? That's very important. But also, I really think that if you center Black women specifically in your work, the kind of generative possibilities of what you actually get to understand about the whole world, I can't even put a number on, right? And it's because, as I said, when you are looking at folks, particularly I study technology, when you're looking at folks who have had things withheld and have still made do and have still figured it out, then you actually get to understand the tech. You really don't understand it by studying the designers of it, right? Or studying the folks that it was created for, because you're really studying such a narrow box and such a narrow space of the possibilities. And so I think that it is the most generative way to study communication, to study technology, is by turning our attention to the creative capacities and expertise of Black folks.
There's a question in the chat, which might, just because of time, have to be our last question. And then Tanisha, I see your hand up. Tanisha, do you want to pop your question in the chat? Just so we don't miss it. What Thomas is asking, what your perspectives are on the role of infographics in social justice movements, kind of which are the most effective and which might be the most harmful. If you guys have thoughts.
Can you go first?
You can go ahead. I don't have a strong expertise on it.
Yeah, so I'll speak more generally, not simply to infographics, but to any kind of medium that takes complex material and provides it in a form that is easily able to be transmitted and understood quickly, right? So that might be an infographic, but it also could be short video content. It could be mimetic, right? And I write about this a little bit in the book in the last chapter, when I think about things like Black feminism becoming a product and what it means for us to create our thought work in these forms that can go viral, and how I think so many of us get really excited about those possibilities. I sometimes have students create infographics, right, for the kind of topics we look at. There are really generative, I think, pedagogical reasons to lean into those sometimes. But when I lean into those in the classroom, I've spent a whole semester talking about that theory, thinking about it, processing it, analyzing it. And then the students create the infographic to kind of reflect and review what they've accomplished. I think sometimes what we're doing right now is, in the desire to go viral and desire to have information pass to the most people possible, we're creating superficiality or commodity out of things that shouldn't be commodified because there's a cost to commodifying them, right? Like, so terms like intersectionality they lose meaning as people start to share them in ways that are not what intersectionality meant, right? They're not what intersectionality was attempting to do. They're not what Crenshaw or Hill Collins or any of these other folks who've been writing about these for decades were actually talking about. Intersectionality becomes a label, like it's an intersectional book, and this is an intersectional class, and this is an intersectional t-shirt, right? And then it doesn't mean anything anymore. So I would say that there is a balance that we have to strike to using things like memes and infographics and short viral content to garner interest in something or to reinforce a concept. But when we rely on that as the primary way that we're trying to teach complex ideas about the lived experiences of marginalized communities, it's not going to get us all the way there. So in context, they can be super helpful, but out of context, we have to remember that there are folks whose lives are built on taking things like that and using them to cause further harm, right? So we have to really think about that as a part of our design practice and our design thinking.
Yeah, I think the question of the design thinking and the design practice and kind of how to build that kind of how to build all of the complexity of what infographics do in terms of reduction and utility is really useful. Okay, maybe a 2-minute answer, 1 minute from each of you. Tanisha has a question about the role that monetization plays in your research, particularly when the narratives of being, quote, paid your worth are centered for Black people. And I think we see this a lot on social media and Instagram right now. Pay Black people, demand like being paid your worth. So how does that kind of factor into both of your practice and research and experience? I hope I did justice to your question, Tanisha.
I was gonna add the other piece of like thinking in terms of like Twitter, and they have the like option for people to monetize by hosting spaces, but that comes with having a certain amount of followers and a certain level of engagement. So I wanted to add that part. Okay.
Thank you. Perfect.
I'll go first because my answer is brief. I wish that they had monetized Twitter when it was a big part of my life. It would have changed a whole lot of things for me. But I will say I, still struggle with the monetization aspect of creating work, period. And so asking for it. I think in the kind of traditional ways we think of women struggling with that, being afraid to assign yourself worth, but also grappling with not wanting to be greedy, you know what I mean? And not wanting to contribute to the commodification of, the work, right? So that means also being choosy in terms of what you'll do, but that makes paid work in general gets dicey when we start talking about I don't want to support the, making this idea that I'm trying to make it bigger. I don't want to accidentally make it smaller or reduce its power by giving it, these broader platforms, even though I need more people somehow to experience it. So it's a very complicated place to be as somebody who also wants to have a decent quality of life and enjoy nice things and, be in therapy weekly to deal with what happens with, when you're an online Black feminist.
Right. Yeah. I echo all of it. I mean, it's complicated. I think people should be paid for their labor. I think Black women especially should be paid for our labor, right? Period and stop. But when that becomes a matter of everything that we do is commodity, like everything about us is commodity, there's also that struggle. And so what I always lean back to is that we are living in a capitalist system we did not create. And yet, I think that a lot of times Black women are asked or expected to reside outside of that system, right? Offer our labor for free or offer our thought work for free within this capitalist system that we did not help build, that we want to destroy, but that we have to survive in the meantime. And so I think that there shouldn't be a question asked of Black women writers, like Black feminist writers, oh, why aren't you offering these services to everyone for free? Because I live in a capitalist system too, and my light bill is just like yours, and my kids need shoes too, right? All of those things are true. And so there is this real complication to it, and that's really how I close out the book, is that none of this is easy, and none of this I'm going to cite Sarah Florini, who's on the call too. I think she's like, if white supremacy or capitalism was easy to destroy, we would have done it by now. These systems are complicated and they're complex for a reason, and that's why they stay intact. And so we live in that complicated system, and I think we navigate it the best the way that we can, and that's what we're all trying to do right now.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful kind of punctuating point for our conversation. Catherine, Jamilah, I want to thank you guys for sharing your insight, sharing your experience, sharing your stories, your relationship to technology, your relationship to social media. I think we all learned a great deal. I want to thank everyone in the audience for being here. Always our organizing family, Stories family. We appreciate all of you. Our next event is in April. It is featuring Selma James and Chanda Prescott Weinstein. And we will be continuing the conversation about Feminism's archives with an intergenerational conversation about social movement work. So again, everybody, please join me in thanking Jamilah and Catherine. And I want to wish everybody a wonderful evening. And for those Princeton folks, a restful spring break.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
Great being here.